Our next story comes from Gladys Deutsch-Horowitz. Gladys grew up in Queens and recently retired from her career as director of early childhood programs, but she's still working in her field as a consultant. She loves hiking, traveling, and spending time in nature. I really loved Gladys's response, her utopian response, when I sent her my dream exodus question. She said, "Next year, I would like to be together with my husband, children, and grandchildren in a place, although I'm not exactly sure where that place is, where people value safety, health, education, and the environment more than money, power, and guns. I hope that place is warm, sunny, and on the water." It would have to be. It would definitely have to be, and I certainly would want to join you in there, and I'm sure many people would want to join you there, Gladys. Please welcome Gladys Deutsch-Horowitz. Do you need help with the mic?
No, I can do it.
Okay.
So I've been sitting here, and I see what it says. If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. I'm not sure if I'm going to remember, but I speak the truth. So I grew up in Queens in an apartment, and I had lots of friends in my building. We played outside, we went into each other's apartments, and I think of my childhood as being pretty carefree and happy. This despite the fact that my mother was a Holocaust survivor. She grew up in Cologne, Germany, and when the war broke out, she and her mother Giddel, who I'm named after, and her sister Emma, and her brother's fiancée Selma were deported to Krakow. She also, in a Jewish ghetto, and she also spent time in several concentration camps. But she also told pretty positive stories about her childhood, and they resonated with me throughout my childhood. Her oldest sister, Sophie, was 15 years older than her. She described Sophie as being very modern, and Sophie went to cafes on Shabbos, and Sophie smoked cigarettes, and that seemed to really particularly delight my mother. And she also took her to the cafes. She said she would schlep me to the cafes sometimes. During this time when many Jewish families would not allow any German products in their house, my mother thought that German products were better. And she used the face cream. She used a German face cream, Nivea cream. And you could get it in just about every drugstore in our neighborhood. But even that, if you got it directly from Germany, it was better than if you got it here. And she actually asked friends of hers or relatives who did sometimes go to Germany during that time, that was what she would ask them to bring back for her. So as I grew up, it felt to me like the Holocaust was a very bad thing that happened a long time ago and was removed from my life. So fast forward, I'm in my 40s, and I'm in the house that I live in with my husband Sidney and my sons Andy and Jesse in New Haven. And I'm watching TV in my room, and I'm flipping through the channels, and I stop when I hear a man whose voice, and even the way he looked, was very familiar to me. His accent was very much like people that I had grown up with, my parents' friends and relatives during my childhood. And he was talking, and it turned out that he was on the TV show Shoah. It was a documentary, actually, that was being showed on PBS at the time. He had been a barber before the war, and he was talking about his job in the concentration camp of shaving people's heads before they went into the gas chamber. He spoke about this with great anguish, and it just hit me as I was listening to him that this horrible, horrible story, this was part of my mother's story. This was my family history. And I started almost at that moment to develop a prejudice against Germans, and there are no longer going to be any German products in my house. So, and I also started to remember some other stories that my mother told about her past. She, the last time she saw her mother, she was in the ghetto in Krakow, and the people in her area of the ghetto were rounded up, she said, and they were divided into two groups, those who were seen as good sources of slave labor, and those who were seen to be too feeble or old. And her mother was put in that second group. And that was the last time that she saw her mother. And her mother was later killed in Auschwitz. She talked about she had found, when my mother was little in Cologne, she set her hair on little pieces of cloth. And she said when she was in the camp, she found some rags, and she decided to set her hair with those rags. And one of the women guards in the camp saw this, and she beat her. And my mother said she couldn't stand it, that I still had some spirit. She was on the death march at the end of the war. She had been given a loaf of bread and some margarine. And she told me that when she was finished with the bread, she ate the margarine. And when she told me that, I went, "Ew." And she said, "But I had something to eat." And I understood that I was talking to somebody who knew what starvation is, something that I gratefully had no clue about. So sometime later that year, or maybe it was the following year, I was hosting the Seder. And a couple of days before Passover, my coffee pot broke. So I went to Macy's to get a new one, and my son Andy, who was kind of a young adolescent at the time, was with me. And all they had were Krups and Braun. So I went into a little tizzy, and I just said, "Okay, there'll be no coffee at our Seder this year." And I got in line to pay for some other things I was buying, and while I was waiting, Andy came over with a box with a Krups coffee pot, and he said, "Look, Mom, it's made in Mexico." And I said, "Yes, but you know that they went to South America, they went to Mexico. I don't want that coffee pot." And he rolled his eyes and he looked at me the way just only an adolescent son can look at their mother. And I succumbed, and I bought the coffee pot. So now we're at the Seder, and of course, I have to talk about how the story of this coffee pot. And my friend Michael, who was there, said, Krups Works, they were this huge ammunition manufacturer in Germany. And I said, "Okay, so I'm going to take this coffee pot, I'm going to take it outside, I'm going to break it, I don't want it, it's going to drive me crazy." And my mother said, "What? A new coffee pot? Then give it to me." So it was then that I realized what incredible spirit, what incredible resilience she had, and that it was time for me to let go of that. So that night, we had great coffee made in a German coffee pot.
Really great, Gladys. Really, really good. And Gladys, in Gladys's bag is a little pot of the Nivea hand cream, right? Oh, was it Jeanette with the hand cream? But everyone oohed and awed. Like, there was a lot of like, yes.